We just got done doing 4 weeks where we were looking at evidence for Christ, sort of the historical evidence that Jesus existed from sources outside of the Bible. And if you're interested in that, 3 of the 4 are on YouTube. And the 4th one, I'll try to get it this week. I just didn't get to edit it this week. But some of what we're going to do today is going to there'll be a little bit of review of some of that material. So if I go through it a little bit fast, it's because it's sort of review for everybody else. But it's worth checking out, because sometimes people think all this stuff about Jesus is just in the Bible, and that's just not true.
When Bob Duco was here that week, I bought his complete set of 10 proofs, and the very first disc goes through the evidence outside the Bible for the life of Christ.
So you'll probably, this will be familiar to you too. Right. That's great.
He has a PhD in this. Yeah.
And so today we're going to look at evidence for the resurrection. And this is especially useful for when you're dealing with other people, like if you're in the evangelism class, if you're dealing with people sharing the gospel, and you have to believe. If you believe in the risen Lord, you're saved. Well, some people, they don't know enough about these things to even know it's a big thing to say, I believe that someone rose from the dead, because that's an unusual thing to happen, right? So we can look at ways things to say to people that will give credibility to that claim. And sometimes when you're on the spot, we get little bits here and there, but it's kind of hard to remember on the spot evidence to argue, right? Or to present. Yeah.
I heard a story this morning on, I watched different preachers, David Jeremiah and Charles Stanley. Anyway, he told a story about this little boy who had built a boat, and he spent a lot of time carving the boat and painting it and everything, and really taking good care of it. And he took it out, and he was going to sail it. Well, when he sailed it, all of a sudden this waves came up, and it took it away, completely away, and he was so sad. And a year went by, and he was in town, and he was walking by this store, in like a pawn shop, and that's my boat. And so he went in and he said, that's my boat, to the clerk. And he said, well, it's $14. Oh. And so he reached in his pocket, and he had crumpled bills, and he said, okay, I want to buy that back. And that's what Jesus did for us. He created us, and he bought us back.
Very nice.
And I love that analogy.
Yeah. So here we've got Christ is alive. So this is going to be a memory aid, a mnemonic. And some of you might have already been familiar with this, because I didn't come up with this. As far as I know, it was somebody named Mike Winger, who has a lot of material on YouTube and things like that. So it's 5 points that if you can remember this, even if you can't remember all of them, this ought to help you to remember a few of them. And I like it too, because the order that they're arranged, it kind of works out, I think, to sort of build a crescendo towards the strongest arguments. And all 5 of these points are things that are relatively non-controversial, in that everything that deals with Jesus or the Bible, there's, we've talked about people will go so far as to deny that Jesus ever existed. But among, say, like historians, that's not a claim that any secular historian really takes seriously. And really all 5 of these claims are really indisputable from a historical standpoint. And together they provide really strong evidence that Christ did in fact rise from the grave. So the 5 points are, the first one is a death by crucifixion, that he did in fact die, and he died by means of crucifixion. He didn't, the crucifixion is something that we'll see, it's not just in the Bible, but sources outside of the Bible attest to the reality that he was crucified. And when you're crucified by Romans, they kill you. There's no maybe he survived, right? They know how to kill people, and there's evidence that he was confirmed dead. And then the second one is that ladies found the tomb, and we'll get into why on the surface that doesn't seem like something that, well, then of course Jesus was raised from the dead, but it's really about credibility. And then the next one is independent appearances of the risen Christ. All the people, not just the apostles, but lots of people that saw him and bear witness to the fact that he was raised from the dead. And then there's the violence endured by the apostles, which, especially in contrast to their behavior prior to the crucifixion, what emboldened these people to not recant, even at the threat of beatings, imprisonment, and death, right?
And they all have the same story.
Yeah. And then finally, that there are enemies of Christ who are converted. And it's one thing when you have Christ's best friends sticking to their story, but you have people who started out not trusting in Jesus and who were his enemies, who ended up doing a complete flip.
Yeah.
So to start with, when it comes to the crucifixion, we have in the Bible not just one account. The Bible is not a book written by somebody. It's a collection of books. When it was written, there was no New Testament, right? These eventually became known as the New Testament, but these are, you've got 7 or 8 authors. I didn't put Jude on here because there's really no picture of Jude. When you do find a picture of Jude, it's, well...
No.
Oh.
I just wanted to
see a picture of Lou.
Oh, Lou. Well, I use Jude Law.
Really want that. Is the people, the producers of The Chosen, I mean, they really got James right. I mean, look at it. See, there's him in The Chosen. And there's him painted in the 16th century.
Yeah. Now, the reason I like this picture of James is because it looks kind of similar to paintings of Jesus. So they look like they're brothers. Although sometimes I see this very same picture of James identified as James, John's brother. But there's a lot of confusion even in art, just like there is in theology, about which James is which. There's James, John's brother, there's James the Less, and there's James the Lord's brother. Catholics, I think it is, teach that James the Less of the 12 apostles is the same James as James the Lord's brother, but in Scripture that doesn't seem to be the case. When we'll kind of get to that too, because we're going to talk about James some today.
Are there books that do describe their countenance and their looks?
No, this is all just a visual aid. I consistently kind of use these same pictures. I kind of like this art style. Yeah. So anytime I talk about these guys, I just throw this picture. But these aren't actual photos.
But those are the friendly guys, the friendly witnesses.
Yeah. And the only picture, like I say, I find of Jude is labeled as one of the 12 apostles. There were two Judases. Jude is short for Judas. There was Judas Iscariot, and there was Judas, not Iscariot, as John calls him. Sometimes he's called Thaddeus also. So he may have gone by that name to to distinguish him from the other Judas, especially after that. But that's another very common name. It's Judah, right? So you have James is Jacob in Hebrew, and Jude is Judah, Judas. So you can imagine those names, and then Miriam is Mary. Those 3 names are all over the place. So even when you say Jude of James, are you talking about which James? And, is that his father or his brother? But all that's to say, we have Matthew, John, Paul, James, and Peter all claim that they saw Jesus after the resurrection. Mark and Luke, we don't have claims that they saw him firsthand, but they give historical accounts where, just like any historian, is unlikely to have been there for the events that they record, but they get their information from other primary sources, interviews and things like that. We know that Mark, one of his primary sources was Peter. So Mark's,
not all of those guys were at the crucifixion.
Correct. We don't have any indication that Paul was there, but he claims that he saw the risen Christ after the ascension firsthand. Mark, according to extra biblical history. He wasn't present during Christ's earthly ministry, but we can see in Acts that he was on the scene fairly early post-resurrection, but he didn't seem to have encountered the Lord himself.
Wasn't there 500 that come?
Yes. Dan's stealing my
Talk
thunder.
about witnesses.
Yeah, we're going to get there, right? No, that's right.
500 men,
That's
not
right, Dan.
women.
That's right.
Did a lot of writing there.
So,
Dan, teach this class.
so you've got, 7 or 8, maybe 9, depending on who wrote Hebrews. Although even the Hebrews writing is not a first-hand account. It's another one. We have heard these from those who heard the Lord, which is consistent with what we know of
So
Mark.
those guys were friendly.
These are the friendly witnesses. You've got 5 eyewitnesses, maybe 6. We don't really know about Jude, and 2 others that are giving historical accounts. So we call these the Bible today. And so when people say, well, where are the people who believe in the resurrection outside of the Bible? Well, that's kind of a silly question. It's like, where are the non-Christians who are going around saying that Jesus rose from the dead?
Right.
Like the ones that were saying that, a lot of them their writings end up in the Bible. And then, aside from that though, Robbie, did you have a question?
I do.
Yeah.
In a court of law, you cannot have hearsay.
Yes.
So if you're going before the court, by hearsay, I mean, I can't say that I heard. I can't come in and testify. You're under crime. I can't say I heard that that Dan said you did it.
Right.
My testimony would be
Be an
disqualified.
eyewitness.
But you
have
could
to be
say, you could testify that Dan said that you did it. You could at least testify of someone else's testimony, right? That's like the secondhand thing, right? Like what you're saying is like if a policeman says, I interviewed so-and-so and they said this, that's
admissible.
right.
Okay.
So that's, we have,
The policeman allegedly has credibility, right?
yes, so we have a combination here of firsthand witnesses and sort of historical accounts in the Bible by not firsthand witnesses.
But back then, there were people who doubted the credibility.
That's true.
That's what they did, right? Even though they're credible people, they doubted it because they themselves couldn't fathom that he rose from the dead.
Sure, and there's people
So,
who had
therefore, I don't believe it. It didn't
a
happen.
vested interest in it not being true, too, right?
Yeah.
They couldn't refute that people were witnessing this. They couldn't refute that Jesus did miracles, but they said, "Oh, he must be a sorcerer," right? So there's anyone can, if they have their heart set on denying reality, they can
And
find
these
a
are
way
the
to do
people
it.
who believe that God parted the sea and brought the Israelites over,
Yeah,
right?
right.
But
And
yeah,
people who are looking forward to the Messiah coming.
Yeah.
So outside of the friendly witnesses that we have in the Bible, we have, this is some of what we've gone over the last few weeks. We've got extra biblical historians that are kind of neutral. They're not saying this happened, but they're reporting that people say this happened, right? So
Hearsay program, yeah.
Right. So Josephus says, and this is just an excerpt from a longer paragraph he wrote about Jesus, but he says, now there was about this time Jesus, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, right? So he's saying Jesus was
Is
crucified.
that when he took a vote from the crowd? That was the principal?
Well,
men?
the Sanhedrin and stuff, the people who brought him and said, hey, we'd like you to crucify him. And he says,
Oh, I see.
well,
Okay.
judge him according to your own laws. It's like, well, we'd like to, but we're not allowed to put him to death because Rome won't let us. So you have to do it. And and if
So
you
that
don't, we're
wasn't
going to
the
tell
time when
Caesar.
it says you've got a choice, Jesus or Barabbas. or-
This is the whole thing, right?
Oh,
This is,
okay.
I mean, you know the story, right? So Josephus says Pilate executed Jesus by crucifixion, right? It's outside the Bible, and he's saying Jesus died through crucifixion. Tacitus, also, early 2nd century, so this is just a little bit after Josephus, but not much. He says Christus, the founder of he spells it Christian, but it's that's not a misspelling. That's how he spelled
That's
it.
how he's spelling
because this was kind of early on where people are writing down what they're hearing. And anyway, he says he was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea, in the reign of Tiberius. So he doesn't specifically say by means of execution, but we know that, by means of crucifixion. But we know that crucifixion was used by the Romans at this time, and he's at least saying Jesus, Christus, was put to death by Pilate during Tiberius's reign, which is all consistent with the biblical account. Yeah. And then you've got the hostile witnesses, and we talked about Lucian of Samosata, who would mock Christians, and he writes that Christians still worship the man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult into the world. And so here you've got somebody who was hostile to Christians. He thought they were foolish, and he seems to be using crucified as in like a pejorative way, like kind of like you hear today when people who don't like Trump will constantly say that he was twice impeached.
Do rumors, yeah.
Being crucified's a shameful thing, right?
Look at
So
his picture, he looks evil.
yeah. So even Christ's enemies would point out that he was crucified as sort of an attempted dig, right? But they weren't saying he wasn't crucified. And this guy, this was in the 2nd century, so this wasn't all that long later in history. And then you have a particularly hostile witness, even you could say a false witness in the Talmud, which is, this is the side of the story that was passed down by the Pharisees, who was, the ones that were motivated to kill Jesus.
You got a handout?
No, I don't, because my printer ran out of ink. Sorry, Lynn.
That's all right.
I have a PDF.
We already went over that.
But according to the Talmud, he was stoned to death, and then his corpse was hung.
Yeah.
Now, why do they say that? Well, because the things that they're accusing him of, sorcery, idolatry, leading people into idolatry and things, those were capital crimes punishable by stoning according to God's law. And so they wished that they could have stoned him. If you recall, every time Jesus would say something indicating that he was God, they would pick up stones to throw at him, to stone him, but held themselves back because they could get in trouble if they went through with it. That's what they wanted to do. And so the oral tradition that was eventually recorded in the Talmud was that, yeah, we did it totally by the book. He had 40 days to defend himself, and then he was stoned. But then they're dealing with this reality. Everyone knows that he was hung. And so they say, yeah, we hung him, his dead body, after we stoned him. So even in their false witness, they're still admitting that he was hung because just everybody knows it.
Do they mean he was hung on the cross?
Right,
Or
right.
from a tree?
Same thing, right? Like even the apostles say he was hung from a tree. We don't really know if it was an actual tree. It very well might have been.
Wood from a tree, so
But, just like we don't know what the apostles look like, we don't really know what this crucifixion scene looked like
I know
exactly.
They want to say something.
He may have been
from
hung.
tree.
He may have been hung on an actual tree. We don't know, but it wouldn't be as good for the decorations that we have. It'd be a little,
Isn't
you know.
it, and the Talmud,
But that was centuries later that the sort of the cross image became prominent.
and the Talmud was a book of not laws, but
Oral traditions that were then recorded in writing.
So-
After the temple was destroyed and the Jews aren't really centrally located in Jerusalem anymore, they're scattered. And so they started to move towards writing down the things that used to be transmitted orally. This is kind of like when you've got grandma's recipe and she would rather teach you how to make the bread.
Yeah.
But you go, Grandma, I'd really like it if you'd write this down. Eventually, you might get her to do it, but she's more inclined, she would rather show you. And so a lot of the stuff that's in the Talmud is things that used to be communicated orally.
In support of the Old Testament.
Well, this is where, when Jesus says, why do you set aside the commandment of God in favor of your tradition? Your tradition is what ends up eventually getting written down in the Talmud. So sometimes it was rightly kind of expanding or explaining the things that were in the law. Other times there were things that ended up being in conflict or kind of missing the point. Like all that stuff about when Jesus says, when the Pharisees said, hey, you guys aren't washing your hands the right way before you eat, because they had this whole procedure. That's in the Talmud, that procedure. So this was something that they would do, all these laws, like the Bible says, don't boil a calf in its mother's milk. And so they go, well, let's never have meat and dairy in the same building, right? It's like these expansions and things that may or may not be anything like what was actually in the law.
Prisoner of their laws.
So a cheeseburger is absolutely out of this. You can't.
It is if you're that sort of Jew, right?
But I'm not.
Right.
But, meat and cheese and dairy.
Yeah. They don't want meat and cheese, because what if the milk came from,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Well, whenever one friend talks to me and contradicts the Old Testament versus the New Testament, she always says, when I say, Jesus came to fulfill the law. He didn't come to do away with the law.
Right.
It's not like we don't have to follow some laws. And I only say that in the sense that the Ten Commandments, for example.
It sounds like Jan wants to talk about circumcision.
Stop. Wait a minute. Let's get back to that. Let me finish my thought. Because she always says that, then I guess we can't mix threads.
Right.
Because in the Old Testament it says you should have
Ceremonial.
Okay, so that, but how did that make you think of circumcision, may I ask?
Oh, just because I'm just
When you talk-
I'm
because-
teasing with you, Janice.
Because
We love you,
the
man.
law and circumcision are synonymous. If you're under the Jewish law, you're under circumcision. It's the covenant of circumcision. And so when the Jews were telling the Gentiles, all right, you have to be circumcised, what they really meant was you have to keep all the law.
And we say, heck no?
Yeah. And Paul says, look, you don't need a list of rules, even for the part of the law that is universal, because there's an element of the law that applies to the whole world, and it's not about mixing threads. If an unbeliever is going to die in his sins, the sin isn't going to include mixing fabrics. It's going to be things like murder, theft,
Sleeping around.
yeah, lust and things like that. So that part of the law, the moral aspect, is universal. But there were certain parts of the law that were specific to Israel. But then they also made all these extra laws, these procedures, and that's part of what's in the Talmud, as well as just other oral traditions like what a terrible guy Jesus was and how it was right that we killed him. And we totally killed him 100% the way the Bible says we should have, and gave him a fair trial. It wasn't a kangaroo court overnight. He had 40 days to defend himself. He was found guilty of sorcery and idolatry, and so we stoned him because that's what the law says. That's what they say. That's a false witness. But even in their false witness, they say, and then we hung his body on a tree, which is, that much. It's like, okay, there's that little bit of truth that when you're telling a lie, you can't deny the part that everyone knows that he was hung, right? So they have to have that in their story, even in their
Interesting.
dishonesty.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about the ladies discovering the empty tomb. And some of these slides, you guys all know this story. But this is in all four Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all attest to the women being the first to get to the tomb and finding that it was empty and being informed that Jesus was raised from the dead.
Praise God.
Why does that matter? Why is that evidence for the resurrection? So I'm gonna jump through these a little bit in the interest of time. I really put these in here thinking that I have a handout, but then I don't have a handout. So in Luke, when the women come and tell the apostles about this, and by the way, it wasn't just they saw the empty tomb, but then when they were on their way to the apostles, they saw the Lord himself.
Yeah.
Matthew, Mark, and John all mention that. Luke doesn't mention that, but he doesn't say it didn't happen either. But when they get there and say that he's risen, the apostles didn't believe him. They thought their words were like idle tales. Now, I want to cut them some slack because there were also the two that Jesus encountered that were men on the road to Emmaus, and they told the 12 too, and they didn't believe them either. Right? They just weren't believing anybody.
I never heard of Joanna. Who in the heck is that?
One of the women. So in some of the Gospels, they're just referred to and the women.
Where does it say Joanna in the Bible?
In Luke 24.
Right there.
No, I didn't know
It's okay.
So depending on which gospel you're reading, it'll mention some of the women and not others, but you get the impression that the ones that are listed aren't the others. Like even here it says, and the other women. So we don't really know how many there were total or have a full roster, but you could see, some of them we know were there, and then we don't know who else. Dan?
It seems like that the women had more of a connection to the Lord in this situation than the men did. The men were off, afraid, and everything. Here the women were walking right to it, and the Lord met them. And
so you're getting to why this is important.
oh,
If you were making up,
teach this class. No.
if you were concocting this story because you want to trick everybody, you would not write that the women were the ones to make this discovery. For two reasons. For one thing, your own pride. Like, people don't, when they're making up stories about themselves, they don't tend to put themselves in a bad light. So if the apostles, if Matthew and John are telling this story, or they're making it up, the fact that they're saying, well, we were all locked up in this secret room hiding from the Romans, and the women went, before it was even light, to the empty tomb, which, as far as they knew, was going to be sealed up, but they didn't even know how they were going to get in there, but they wanted to tend to his body, and they're like, we'll figure it out when we get there. And then they found the tomb. Like, that doesn't make them look great, right? That's not the kind of thing that they would be inclined to make up if they were inventing the story. But if that's the way it actually happened, and then they just have integrity. And the fact that they're admitting and united in this idea that the women were the ones that were there first, that's an embarrassment. Like, that's the kind of story, like, when people tell embarrassing stories about themselves, you tend to believe it faster than when they tell you, how big the fish was that they caught, right? Something where they're
how big was it?
The women were always the ones that took care of the body,
sure.
and that was,
that
is part of the reason they were there.
That's
Even
true.
if they didn't, at that point, have a body to take care of,
Right.
and they didn't know, they
But-
went there because of tending the body.
That's a
whether
good
they
point.
did
That is a good point. But the other piece of this is, in that culture, women weren't considered credible witnesses. Now, this isn't, I'm not saying that that's the way it should have been, but that was just the reality of the day. So again, if you're making up a story, you wouldn't say, and here's what the women came and told us, like they were the first, like, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't say, well, this happened, just ask these women, right? Like, that's a bad way to come up with a story that other people are going to be inclined to believe. And so it's sort of like has the opposite effect in the effort, just telling the truth. The fact that it's a little bit inconvenient for convincing people, which kind of makes it convincing. Lou?
In Roman and Greek culture, a woman could not give it. Only men could give testimony because only men had that body part.
That word testimony
So honestly, it comes from that. Females could not give testimony because they didn't have that hormone going through them.
Really?
That's where it came from.
Sure has changed today.
And if you were a male, you would put your right hand up and your left hand in another place, and you would swear. And if they caught you lying, you would be a eunuch.
You know what also is interesting about this too, if the disciples had wanted to try to also show that they were involved, they could have, at the moment they heard from the women that the tomb was empty, they could have gone to the tomb to confirm it.
Right.
And they did not.
Yeah.
They were hiding, they were afraid. So this even makes more sense that these were credible witnesses.
Yeah.
Because the men could have come over and said, yeah, we found the tomb was empty, and
Or-
completely ignored what the
Or
women said.
we escorted the women to the tomb.
They could have.
Right? I mean, it's dark out.
Absolutely.
The sun isn't even fully up yet.
Right.
I mean, it's not even over the horizon. It's probably just starting to get light. It says it was still dark. And there the women are heading to the tomb, knowing that it's under guard from the Romans and everything. And there's no guys to kind of like make sure that they
Make
get
it
there
safe.
okay. Right. Yeah. So that's embarrassing for the guys too. So just, lest you go, well, all this stuff is one thing to say. Back in those days, here's how it was. Well, here's some evidence that this was the way it was in those days. This is in Josephus's Antiquities, and a lot of what's in Antiquities is sort of a retelling of the things that we see in the Bible. But here we've got sort of a combination of things that are in the Bible and aren't in the Bible. Kind of like you could say written tradition and oral tradition intermingled here. But he says concerning laws and witnesses and things like that, he says, but let not a single witness be credited, but 3, or at least 2, and those whose testimony is confirmed by their good lives. But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex, nor let servants be admitted to give testimony on account of the ignobility of their soul, since it is probable they may not speak truth either out of hope of gain or fear of punishment. But if anyone believed to have borne false witness, let him, when he is convicted, suffer the very same punishments which he, against whom he bore witness, was to have suffered. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Now,
makes sense.
is this in the Bible?
No.
Some of it is.
Is it?
Yeah. So the first part, I've got it tinted in green, matches in Deuteronomy 19:15. One witness, but 2 or 3, right? So he's just paraphrasing that, which is great. And then there's nothing about women. There's nothing about servants or slaves. And then the whole idea about if you're trying to use the law as a weapon, that the just punishment is whatever was at stake in that crime. If you accuse someone of theft, the punishment for theft is restitution. And so you're trying to use the government to steal from someone else. Now you have to pay restitution to them. If you accuse someone of a capital crime, that's attempted murder. You're trying to kill someone using the government, governing authorities as a weapon. And so now the punishment would be death. And this goes on past what I've got quoted here, life for life, blow for blow, all that stuff. The punishment is equal to the crime. And in the case of bearing false witness, the crime and the punishment depend on what the accusation is. But there's nothing in there, that middle part that's in yellow isn't there at all. So this is stuff that the Jews had added as their oral tradition. Just hold that thought 1 minute. And what you can see here too is it's sort of redundant, because if we had a system, this last law here about the penalty for bearing false witness, if that were actually in place, you wouldn't have to worry so much about the motivations of a servant, right? Like the stakes are high enough that all this stuff, well, this person might have a conflict of interest. Well, if their life is on the line, right? All these concerns about servants or women or whatever, even if there is any kind of situation where that is a consideration, the false witness penalty would sort of eliminate any of that. So it's sort of redundant anyway.
Verified on tape and they still go free.
Yeah.
Right.
On the other hand, you have in our system, rarely does a false witness have any ramifications. You could accuse people of all kinds of terrible things for political reasons. This happens, and there's no penalty, and so there's nothing to dissuade that from being done over and over again.
In fact, they're encouraged.
Sounds like today.
Yeah,
They're
exactly.
encouraged because they don't.
Right.
No retribution, but go ahead, I'm sorry, Robbie.
My question is, because the law does not distinguish between men and women giving testimony, were women allowed in Hebrew courts? Were women allowed to testify?
Apparently not, right? Not because God forbade it, but because the Jewish culture did, right? So here in Josephus, we have a recording of the Jewish ways, which wasn't strictly what's in Scripture, but it's also those oral traditions that sometimes come into conflict with God's intentions, right? The
Okay, so
traditions
it
of
wasn't
men.
just the Greeks and the Romans who didn't
Right.
allow women, it was.
Yeah, because here
Pretty much the whole world.
you can see that Josephus is speaking of the Jewish culture in this testimony. He's
Why was
talking.
he
He's
so
describing the
credible,
law.
Josephus?
What's that?
Why was he so credible?
Well, he's a historian. He's
And we actually have his writings.
yeah.
Many of them
He
were
had a very
destroyed.
good reputation too, to,
Yeah.
Janice,
Did I forget my question?
sorry.
Oh.
Because of my lack of understanding of the Bible, such as I didn't know there was a lady named Joanne.
That's okay.
That's
I mean, she's
okay.
just mentioned in passing.
Yeah.
Okay, but in the New Testament, basically women are told not to speak in the church.
Oh boy.
And where does it go in the Old Testament? Is there something similar to that? So that at this time, it would have been inappropriate for women to speak?
Well, we don't. That's like a whole different rabbit trail that's controversial. But it could have been that he was addressing a specific situation and circumstance at that time. But that'd be a different lesson because we would have to look at that text
Yeah.
and look at some of the
That was
details.
Paul speaking.
And so I would just say hold that thought because yeah, it's yeah.
Is that too late out there? Is that, you don't believe that to be true?
No. Paul's writings.
There was a lot of,
He's
Paul-
trying to move on.
Paul's writings were inspired by the Holy Spirit. So if you read something in Paul and you don't like it, then you need to figure out what is Paul saying and how can I align myself to be Christ-like, because Paul was speaking for Jesus. And so if you think, well, I don't like what Paul said here, he must have been adding his own ideas. No, that's what the Talmud does, but that's not what the New Testament does. So
Well, we know that Paul said it's better to not marry. Paul said women shouldn't speak in church at all.
So was Paul wrong when he said that there are advantages to being
God.
single?
no, the thing of it is, the early church, there was a lot of people just getting up and speaking.
That's
everything.
what we're
They
saying.
got so out of order,
It-
Paul said,
It could be he was addressing a specific
Yeah.
situation, and it isn't necessarily universal.
But you have to
But
remember what culture was like until 1790.
yeah.
People lived to be 50. They had 7 kids. Women spent 2/3 of their life pregnant almost all the time. And so, I mean, that's just the way it used to be until
Pregnant and nursing.
pregnant and then women would die like men around age 50. So,
But if we look at this passage, here we see a contrast between the Bible and the culture, right? Concerning women. There's nothing about women can't give testimony. We know there's no man or woman, Jew or Greek in the church, right? So I really this is a long lesson and I'd like to move on. I don't want to have a
Amen.
side discussion about this other stuff. It's okay, but I mean, it's,
next thing you
It's-
want to
it's outside the scope. yeah. Okay. So there is one aside though, while we're here. Finish coughing.
I'm sorry, what?
It's okay, finish coughing. No,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm Gary.
it's fine. It's just that you can't hear what I say over the coughing. So, okay. In the Deuteronomy 19 passage, it says, if a false witness rises against any man to testify against him for wrongdoing, and then it says, then you have to determine whether he's a false witness. So some people will point to this and they go, this doesn't make sense. How can it be if a false witness rises up if you haven't determined if it's a false witness or not yet, right? Doesn't that seem kind of weird? Well, there's a simple explanation for that, and this is a mistranslation. So the word that appears 3 times are false, false, falsely. You'd kind of think that those must all come from the same Hebrew word, right? But they don't. So the first one is Hamas, and the second 2 are sheker, I think it is. But the second 2 is false, but the first one, Hamas, that means violent or sometimes cruel. So this is the idea that someone is an accuser and maybe has a hostile intention in their accusation, that there's a suspicion that they're not, that they might have some wicked motive in bringing forth this accusation. Not every single accusation would be suspicious like this, but this is the idea that this person might have a motive to do this and be investigated. So
The second one is Seeger, S-E-G-E-R.
it's a Q, and the S is pronounced like SH, but so it's like
It's written
Sheeker.
like Seeger, and I'm wondering.
Yeah, that's a Q, not a G.
Oh, it
Wait,
is?
Yeah,
Oh,
because of the
okay.
italics.
So what's that mean, because we don't have the
It,
definition?
it means false.
Oh, it's false.
But you've got
I'm not correcting it.
violent, cruel for
Is it
Hamas, but.
There's no, it would say false, right? It's the same as, it's translated properly, right? So false witness testified falsely against his brother, that word means false. The first time that word appears in English, in the New King James, and I believe in the King James also, it says, if a false witness rises up, well, that word is not the same word. It's Hamas. Does that word sound familiar to anybody?
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
Yeah.
Violent group.
yeah.
It is, and that word, that the organization is it's an acronym, and in Arabic, it means something more like zeal, like
Bravery.
zealotry, bravery. It doesn't have quite as negative connotations, but the etymology of the word, those are closely related languages. They're kind of like Italian and Spanish, right? They have a common root. So certainly that word Hamas, which means bravery or zeal, has this connotation of violence. Where else does this word appear in the Bible? Lots of places, but one that's familiar is in the days of Noah, violence filled the earth.
Yeah.
Hamas filled the earth. That's where that word is in a setting that's familiar to us, among lots of other places. Most places this word appears, it's violent or violence.
Why was it translated as false if it was Hamas?
People are imperfect. I don't know. It's just trying to get the point across. It was a judgment call and maybe not the best one. If you look in Young's literal translation, which is a good resource, it says a cruel witness, I think, or something like that. So yeah, it's just a kind of a minor point. So yeah, we should cross out in your Bible, if you're inclined, just cross that out and write in violent. Unless you have one that properly translated to begin with. Make a little note in the margin. Anyway, in the another example of this, women being looked down upon in the Jewish culture from 2,000 years ago, in the Jewish Talmud, again, this is some centuries later, but recordings of earlier oral traditions. You've got this Rabbi Eliezer who says, the wisdom of a woman is only in her spinning rod. As it is written, all wise women spin with their hands. Sooner should the words of the Torah be burned than entrusted to women.
Whoa.
Now, that quote, all women spin with their hands, is, when you say as it is written, that's an indication that's from the Old Testament, right? So that's in Exodus 32:25. All the women who were gifted artisans spun yarn with their hands and brought what they had spun of blue, purple, and scarlet and fine linen. Now,
It doesn't
does
quite sound the same.
that sound like all women are good for is to make cloth?
No,
No.
that says they're gifted.
Right. Yeah. And it's just taking, just because women do this doesn't mean that's all they should ever do or all they're good for. So this is a twisting of scripture and, using proof text from the Bible to try to grind your axe against women, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay. So next we have independent appearances of the risen Christ. And we have kind of the most comprehensive go ahead.
So there's only about 10 minutes left. I don't think we're gonna get through all of this, honey, so just consider that.
We might.
Okay.
Thanks.
Oh,
Okay.
I'm staying to the end.
So the best catalog of these independent witnesses is in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul lists kind of the order that these happened. And actually, he doesn't start with the very first, which is the women at the tomb, but he starts with Peter. So of the apostles, it was Peter first, then by the rest of the 12, and really it was the 11 at that time, and then over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. So he's saying a lot of these people are still alive. If you don't believe me, you could go ask them, right? This isn't this isn't the testimony of one guy who had a vision when he was in a cave somewhere, and then you're all supposed to do what he says. He's saying, there's a bunch of people all saying this, and you could go and interview them yourself. Don't just take my word for it.
And they rose from the dead.
Which is, we can't ask them today, right? Because they've been dead for 2,000 years. But we have, at this time, these people were all over Jerusalem and stuff. They could, they,
500
yeah.
men,
That would
and
be
that
a-
doesn't include their women and the children.
Well,
would
that
be a
depends.
shock,
That,
wouldn't it? Your neighbor
I don't want to get off on this again, but pronouns, male pronouns, when you're talking about a group in like every language, can be a mixed group too. So
Yes, like when feeding
doesn't-
5,000, there were women and children there. too.
Yeah.
They're
And I'm just
counting.
repeating what Bob Duco taught
okay,
me, so.
yeah,
that's what he
it
said.
could be. I mean, that's.
Again.
But I don't think when Jesus appears to a crowd that there were only men, right? Or that if you're saying how big's this crowd, you're like, well, what percentage of them are women? I'm saying
What
this
did
this
Bob
could be.
Duco say?
He's saying that it wasn't just 500 because he wasn't counting all the women and children.
Oh.
I'm
I'm
just
saying,
saying there's that many more people.
but if you're
That's
estimating
not
if you're
him.
estimating a crowd size, you
Yeah.
may not be able to determine how many within the crowd are men or women. So that's neither here nor there. It's a lot of people, hundreds of people, no matter what, right? And then you have that he was seen by James, and then by all the apostles. So this isn't just the 12, but sort of the larger group of Christ's disciples. And then he says he was seen by me also as by one born out of due time, meaning that the rest, this all happened during the 40 days where Jesus had not yet ascended, but to Paul, he appeared quite a while later, at least a year or so. So that's where it's sort of like he's out of time. Like he was late. It's late to the party of seeing the risen Lord, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, he was still not a Christian yet.
exactly, right.
That's what he means.
Yep.
Oh, okay, like the
Yep.
40, I thought-
He did see the risen Christ, but not in that 40-day span that everyone else did. Yeah. So in Matthew 28, we see that this is where we see that the women saw Jesus on their way back from the tomb to tell the disciples he encountered them. So the women were actually the first to see him in person. And then there were the two others. Here in Mark, they're mentioned. He appeared in another form, or they didn't recognize him at first, intentionally. Jesus in Luke, it says something about he kind of did something to them so they couldn't recognize him at first, and he's talking to them. This is in what we call the road to Emmaus. So it was first Mary and the women, and then it was these two others, and then finally he appeared to the 11. And all along the way, people were not inclined to believe the testimony of the ones that came before. Again, if you're telling a story and you're saying, and none of us believed it either, right? Like, you should believe, but we didn't believe it, right? Like,
Yeah.
but that's the way it was, right? Yet they became so bold that they were willing to be killed, right? But at first, that wasn't the case. And then this wasn't just a vision. This was a bodily resurrection, and that Jesus made sure that they understood that. He says, look at my hands and my feet. Like, I'm not just a ghost. I'm not just a vision. Touch me.
Yeah.
Feel my wounds. Hey, you guys have anything to eat? Because ghosts don't eat, right? So he has a little fish and a little honeycomb just to demonstrate that he's really there. This isn't a dream. This is, real life. He's actually risen in the body. And then Thomas missed that first encounter, and then he didn't even believe all the 12 apostles. The rest of the 12, it would be 10 at that point, right? Not counting himself. And he's like, unless I see it for myself and touch those wounds, I'm not going to believe it. And then Jesus, we know the story. He puts his hand in his side and everything like that. But every step of the way, there's, on the one hand, people, not the apostles, not being inclined to believe it, but then confirming that this is a bodily resurrection. And he ends up saying, my Lord and my God, affirming the deity of Christ as well. And so at the beginning of Acts, Luke sort of summarizes saying that the apostles, to whom he also presented himself alive after his suffering by many infallible proofs, right? Here I am. Feel my body, touch my wounds, give me something to eat, right? Lots of proof that he had in fact risen, being seen by them over the course of 40 days. And then you have violence endured by the apostles. So these same guys who were running scared at the time of the crucifixion suddenly became very bold and were willing to be beaten, imprisoned, and killed rather than to deny the resurrection. So we have Stephen is recorded in Acts 7 being stoned to death. James, the brother of John, was beheaded in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 12 by Herod Agrippa. Peter was crucified upside down, which Jesus prophesied in John 21:18. Now that seems to have been written by John later than the other Gospels and after this had happened. So he's saying this thing that Jesus said about having your arms outstretched. Maybe they didn't really understand that at the time, but in hindsight, it's like, oh, that's what that meant, because he ended up being crucified upside down. And so John records that after the fact, it seems. And then James, the Lord's brother, we talked about a couple weeks ago, where he was thrown from the temple, he survived the fall, and then he was stoned and beaten to death with a club.
Wow.
And that's in Josephus, and Eusebius quotes Hegesippus and Clement of Alexandria. That's a really solid historical one. Some of the others, we have Paul was beheaded in Rome, and you can see that that's imminent by the way he kind of wraps up 2 Timothy. He's saying, he's at the end of his race, and you can tell he's about to be put to death. But we understand that was a beheading. Some of the other ones are a little bit shaky, like there might be conflicting traditions and things like that, or accounts, because a lot of places probably like to claim that it happened in their town or whatever. But there's some that are particularly solid. I think Thomas, there's reports that he was killed with a spear in East India, which would be kind of ironic because he was putting his hand in the spear wound of Christ. Andrew, Peter's brother, was bound to a cross, not with nails, but with ropes. So he ended up dying of exposure, and that was in Greece, in Achaia. Judas Thaddeus, this is the Judas not Iscariot of the 12, and Simon the Zealot were killed in Beirut, Syria. Barnabas, there's a couple for him, but it seems like the strongest evidence is that he died in Salamis, Cyprus, which was where he was from also. That was kind of his hometown that he ended up in. And if you recall in Acts, when he and Paul parted ways over the dispute with John Mark, they went to Cyprus, which is where they had gone first on the first trip, which was where John had gone with them. And then Paul went kind of the other way. So it seems like he ended up in Cyprus quite a bit. And Luke, there's tradition that he was hung from an olive tree in Thebes. And then John, we have a pretty strong account from him in the 2nd century, from Tertullian, late 2nd century. So not that far removed from, he lived into the 90s, that they tried to kill him by putting him in a vat of boiling oil, but he was protected. And so then he was exiled to Patmos. So all those other guys, a lot of them were being killed like in the 60s and 70s, and yet he lived into the 90s. And you might wonder, well, why didn't they just kill him too? Well, it seems like they tried, but they ended up just.
He had the right revelation.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. God had a reason, and he even alludes to, like, if it's my will that you should live until I come back, I could make that happen. Right. It didn't quite work out like that, but he did live the longest. Mm-hmm. All right. And then finally, we have the enemies of Christ converted, and I'm focusing on two of them. The first one is James, the Lord's brother. Now, this, if you call him an enemy of Christ, we see in John 7 that Jesus was in Galilee and he did not want to go to Judea because the Jews there were wanting to kill him. And this was coming up on the Feast of Tabernacles, which was one of the pilgrimage feasts that the men would be, like Passover, kind of required to go to Jerusalem. So he ought to go to Jerusalem for this feast. And his brothers, but he's trying to lay low, and his brothers say to him, depart from here and go into Judea, that your disciples may also see the works that you are doing. For no one does anything in secret while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. And, just in case you couldn't tell from the text,
Sarcastic.
they were mocking him. They were, his brothers did not believe in him. So they were saying, yeah, go, make a name for yourself. So they want to kill you. Just, you'll impress them with your signs and everything. Like, what jerks, right?
Yeah.
So James was not friendly at this time. Now, did he really want him to die, or was he just being a jerk? Who knows? But he, what would it take to who in here has a brother?
Oh, yeah.
I got 4 of them.
What would it take you to convince you that your brother is God in the flesh?
You probably have to rise from the
Maybe
dead.
if you saw him after he died, right?
Yeah.
And that's what Paul records.
Can I tell a real quick
Yeah,
funny story?
real quick.
Yeah, no.
Real quick.
My family, my grandfather's name is James. My dad's name is James, and my oldest brother's name is James. So we used to tease my older brother. We'd say there's James the Father, James the Son, and James the Holy Terror.
Yeah. So according to Paul, James was among those who Christ visited after the resurrection. And then we see in Acts chapter 1, maybe it wasn't just James, but that in that room where they had that upper room meeting, there were the 12 apostles named, and then the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. So something happened between Christ's ministry and after the ascension, where now his brothers are in the group, right? And so his appearance to James sheds light on that, right? Now James and the brothers are convinced, and they're on board, and they've joined the disciples here. And then we have his epistle too. He introduces himself as James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. So he's affirming that Jesus is Lord now. And we know from a couple weeks ago, we already talked about even today a little bit about his fate is very well documented in history, that he was proclaiming that Jesus is Lord. When he was told to deny it, he proclaimed it. And so they pushed him off the building and then started throwing stones at him. And this guy clubbed him over the head with a fuller club. And that's recorded by Eusebius and Josephus. At least in Josephus just says he was stoned. You get a very detailed telling of it from Hegesippus via a quote in Eusebius's work, Church History. And then finally, the big one, and this is the one, we don't have to go into a lot of detail because we all know the story, Paul, right? Paul was not one of the 12. He was their archenemy. He was rounding up, imprisoning, and killing Christians, and not just Stephen. Stephen's the one that we see about in Acts, but when he's testifying to King Agrippa II, he's telling this story about how he shut up many of the saints in prison, and that when they were being put to death, he would cast his vote against them. He was complicit in their execution, and he was eager to do it. He would punish them in every synagogue and compelled them to blaspheme, which is to say, deny Christ. And being exceedingly enraged against them, he persecuted them, even to foreign cities. He was going from town to town, rounding up, hunting down Christians, seeking to kill them. And when he's on his way to Damascus to do that, that's when he encountered the Lord and he flipped. And then next thing you know, when he gets to Damascus, he's preaching the risen Lord. And people are going, what's happening here? Is this a trick? Is this guy serious? Is he trying to draw people out to, figure it out? And after a few days of this, the Jews go, you know what? He's got to die. They're convinced this isn't just a ruse. He's serious. We've got to kill him. And so he goes from being the hunter to the hunted. And he, for the rest of his life, he's pursued,
Thank God.
beaten, stoned, maybe stoned to death, but resurrected. But he was stoned and left for dead. He was imprisoned and eventually beheaded. And why? Why would somebody do that? if it was all a lie? Like, why would he go from being the persecutor to being like the number one persecuted, right? Unless it's real, unless his testimony was real. And so even, I mean, and it's not just him, like Peter denying Christ, and then next thing you know, he's getting beaten and imprisoned, right? Those two, right? Peter was not showing a lot of courage the night of the trial of Jesus, right? But then a short time after that, there was just no stopping him, right? He would not deny Christ. He said we ought to obey God rather than men, and he preaches the gospel publicly even after he was just imprisoned for doing it. And so that's it. So if you go through those, just keep that in mind, that if you're trying to talk through this with someone, you know, will they at least affirm that the crucifixion happened, right? That's first. And then, isn't there credibility in the story that the ladies found the tomb? Like, that's not the kind of thing you would make up. Really, the whole Bible's like that. Jewish failures, right? Peter denying Christ. Like, these are not tales of like the protagonists. Like, think of David's failures, right? Like, that gives it the flavor of realism and
This is
truth.
Muhammad flying around on a horse.
Yeah. I was all by myself, and I looked in this dark corner, and I saw this gold tablet, and you know, and nobody else was there. Even Paul, when Paul encountered Christ, there were other people with him. Now, were those other people Christians? No, those were his.
They were Roman soldiers.
Yeah, they were his assistants in hunting down these Christians, and he went blind and he saw his vision. They didn't fully see the whole vision, but they saw that this thing was happening with Paul. So that even didn't happen in seclusion, right? And then you have just all these witnesses and the challenge to, if you don't believe me, go and ask all these other people. There's no such thing as a mass delusion, like, this idea of like everyone having the same hallucination.
And then story straight, guys. Come
here. Yeah. Like if they're sincere, right? And then people don't die for things like it's often compared to the Nixon, the Watergate conspiracy, that they all sold each other out. Like if you're next on the line, you don't stay committed to a lie, and people break. But none of these guys broke. And then Paul, like, how do you explain if it didn't really? What did Paul have to gain from becoming a Christian out of some sort of lie? Yeah. So that's it for today. Thanks, guys.